In this video, I'm exploring the difference between a surface photo and a digital texture to use as a texture overlay over your creative images or photos. I've been using digital textures in my workflow for years, but when I first started using the textures, I struggled with the ones I chose. I like to call it the journey of 1,000 textures. What works and doesn't work. What is the difference with digital textures and surface photos? When I first started using textures, I was using textures that I bought. And then I started to photograph my own textures, what I thought would work well as a texture overlay. And there is definitely a difference. Let me show you some of the photos that I took, which I thought would be great textures, but in actual fact, they're just surface photos. What is a surface photo? When we look at something and we see it and we think, oh, that would make a great texture, in our mind and our eye, we're seeing a tactile surface. But when we photograph it, all it becomes is a surface photo of a texture that we've seen in real life. Let me explain. These photos are my own, and I photographed them at different locations. And this is what I call a surface photo. They certainly have a textured look. They've got beautiful colouring, but as a texture overlay, they just don't work. They're too dominant. Let's have a look at this one. I fell in love with the colour of this and the texture, and I thought I've got to photograph it and I can use this as a texture overlay, but it doesn't work for several reasons. The vertical lines where the timber panels meet, it's got a lot of texture in there. Yes, I could remove those vertical lines, but it would be quite labour intensive, and it's very dominant. Let's have a look at another one. I fell in love with this pink door and the peeling paint. Again, it's a surface photo. It looked beautiful as a texture when I saw it with my eyes, but to use it as a texture overlay over a landscape, a creative image, or flower imagery, flat lay, it just didn't work. Let's have a look at another one. This is a beautiful texture of a tree trunk, and I love the colours, I love the pattern and the texture within it. But as a texture overlay to put over another photo or a creative image, it just doesn't work. It's too dominant. This is where what we see as a texture, but it becomes a surface photo when we photograph it. It's too strong in its pattern. These are what I call digital texture overlays. They're a combination of my own photos, Photoshop brushes, and other techniques in colour grading to get the look or the texture that I'm after. For example, let's have a look at this one here. And it's a combination of 3 photos with lots of colour grading to get that beautiful, warm autumn tones coming through. Let's have a look at another one, and we'll come down into this one here, the harvest. This was a combination of a concrete photo, Photoshop brushes, using the smudge tool to blend all together, and colour grading. Now, when people look at a colour like this, what I call harvest gold, it looks very dominant, but I would use this as to give a colour grading effect on some of my images or photos, and it's got a little bit of texture. Let's come down and have a look at a few of these. This texture overlay is from my Distressed Textures collection, and it started off as a base photo of stainless steel barbecue, had lots of scratches on it. Then I've turned it into a black and white. I've added a concrete photo over the top. I've done some colour grading. And this is what makes a digital texture. It's not just a surface photo. It's a combination of techniques. Let's have a look at some others and see what we've got in the texture stash. If I look at this one here, This is a combination of about 3 to 4 photos, I think, from memory, and I've just layered them over the top. I've done colour grading, I've done some brush work. These are what I call digital textures, and that you can use them as a texture overlay for adding a little bit of texture and more for the colour grading. Here is an example of using a surface photo as a texture versus a digital texture. This is one of my own photos, and what I'm going to do is just put a surface photo over the top and then a digital texture to see the difference. All I've done is a levels adjustment. Let's go to the next layer and turn this layer on, and it's a surface photo. And you can see it's quite dominant with the vertical lines. Let's have a look at the opacity. It's at 41%. I'm going to put that up to 100%, change the blend mode to normal. There's that beautiful texture that I fell in love with, the texture patterns, the colour of the green, and that hint of rust coming through. I'm going to go back and change the blend mode, and I'm going to drop the opacity. And this is where, when you're working with textures, you use a combination of the blend modes and the opacity. But even when I've dialed down that opacity, those vertical lines are quite dominant. Now, for me, that doesn't work. The flower is the hero. The texture shouldn't dominate and distract. It should enhance. I'm going to turn that layer off. Now on the next layer, I'm going to use one of the digital textures that's in my textures collection. I'll turn that layer on. Let's have a look at the blend mode. It's multiply and the opacity is at 100%. I'm going to change that to normal. Now that can actually work just leaving it at normal and the opacity. But if you look at this layer, I've done a mask and I've brushed off some of that texture off that flower. If I disable the mask, there's that beautiful texture, and it's got some lovely greens, some warm tones coming through. And I'll just enable that mask. And the reason that I've chose that texture is that I wanted to get rid of that messy leaves. And this can work. But if I didn't want that sort of textured look in the background, I then can come back, change my blend mode. I might go to multiply. I could even go down to overlay. Now, when you do overlay or working with different blend modes, what I find is that background, the natural background is coming through, and it's to me is a distractor. So I'm going to come up and multiply or darken. I'll go to multiply and I'll drop the opacity just down a little bit so I get a little hint of that foliage coming through in the background. And this is why a digital texture will work on your photos or creative images as opposed to a straight surface photo. Turn your photos into art with the help of textures. Picking the right texture can bring your vision to life, while the wrong one can throw it off. I've added a link in the description where you can check out my texture collections in the Imagination shop, and this is the first of a video on a series of textures I'll be sharing with you.